Before the war in Ukraine, it was estimated Russia had somewhere around 12,420 tanks and 36,000 armored vehicles at its disposal, but these numbers can be deceiving. In reality, Russia started the invasion with around 3,000 modern tanks consisting of T-72s, T-80s, and T-90s. As Ukraine prepares to launch its offensive against Russia, the Kremlin is doing something surprising. It's literally dusting off and sending Cold War-era vehicles, some of which date back to the 1940s, to the front lines. In the coming months, the world will watch as Ukrainian forces using modern Western tanks and weapons decimate outdated Russian tech. Data from various sources suggest that when the war in Ukraine started in 2022, Russia had several thousand T-72s, 3,000 T-80s, and about 200 T-90s. Not all these tanks were deployed to the front lines at once, but a large number were included in the initial invasion force. As Ukraine received military support from the West in the form of javelins and other anti-tank weaponry, Russian tank numbers went to rapid decline. These weapons, on top of incompetent Russian soldiers and even more incompetent Russian leadership, led to over 1,000 tanks being lost or captured in the first year of the war. This meant that Russia needed to dig deep into its tank reserves and bring out some incredibly old technology. The result was that T-55s, T-62s, and BTR-50s were all brought out of storage, given a once-over, and then shipped to the front lines on trains. All three of these vehicles are Cold War-era relics that can be found in museums. Now Putin's relying on them to strengthen his tank and armored vehicle numbers. It's estimated that Russia had roughly 2,800 T-55s and 2,500 T-62s in storage. The crazy part is that the design of the T-55s has its roots back in the 1940s, making it a very old tank running off of very old technology. But before we get into the exact reasons why Russia needed to rely on tanks that are well over 60 years old, let's examine how we know Putin is taking such drastic actions with his tank deployments. Satellite imagery has recently been released showing Russian forces moving dozens of tanks out of storage at the 1295th Central Tanks and Repair Storage in Arsenyev, which is about as far away from the front lines as you can get in Russia. It's hypothesized that the Cold War-era tanks being stored at this facility are being loaded onto trains and shipped to the Ukrainian-Russian border. Military experts note these tanks have been sitting at the Arsenyev facility for decades and likely needed extensive work to get them in working order. This just shows how desperate Putin and the Russian military really are right now. In late March, an independent group that labels themselves the Conflict Intelligence Team were the first to report that T-55s and their predecessor, the T-54, were being moved west by train. The T-54 would first go into production in 1947 to provide the Red Army with superior firepower. This means that some of the Russian tanks being sent to the front lines could be over 75 years old, being built when the Cold War had just started. We even know from Western intelligence that these Cold War-era tanks have been spotted on the front lines. So Russia is not just shipping them to Ukraine, they've already been deployed in some areas, meaning that the Russian military is serious about using these antiques in a war that they're already losing badly. This probably shouldn't come as much of a surprise, since there have been at least 544 Russian tanks captured by Ukrainian forces since the fighting began, 79 of which were damaged and another 65 that were completely just abandoned. Unsurprisingly, Putin has not outright confirmed that T-55s and other older generation tanks are being sent to the front lines because it would make him and his military look weak. However, multiple forms of intelligence and reconnaissance have confirmed that Cold War-era tanks are either being brought out of storage, shipped to Ukraine, or actually in battle, since the second year of the conflict has progressed. Unfortunately for the Russian leadership, who are trying to keep the use of outdated tech quiet, there have been some pro-Kremlin outlets that have either by accident or purposely released pictures showing these older tanks in Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine. Some of what we mentioned leads to the first and probably most obvious reason why Cold War tanks are being prepared for battle in Russia. The hard, cold truth of the matter is, Russia has lost a lot of tanks, and since most of the vehicles deployed to Ukraine at the beginning of the war were the newest and supposedly best Russia had to offer, their new tactic of using half-a-century-old tanks probably won't go over very well. A report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies says Russia has lost almost 10,000 units of key military equipment. This includes tanks along with trucks, artillery, aircraft, and drones. An intelligence organization in the Netherlands has reported that it has visual evidence that no fewer than 1,900 Russian tanks have been either destroyed or captured since the beginning of the invasion. This is a staggering 2/3 of the initial invasion force, although other reports state the number might be as high as 3,511 tanks. The T-72 main battle tank, which made up the bulk of the Russian tank forces, has not fared well in this war. The staggering losses that Russia has sustained have led to some real problems, but it's not just the destruction and capture of Russian tanks that are leading to Cold War-era vehicles making their way to the battlefield. Don't get us wrong, the immense devastation to modern Russian tank numbers is definitely playing a role, but there are also some other things going on. One example of this is that the production of new tanks just can't keep up with the number of vehicles being lost. One of the main tank plants in Russia is run by Uralvagonzavod. It can make about 20 tanks a month if it can procure all the necessary components. But since Russia is losing around 150 tanks a month on average in Ukraine, there's no way to replenish the dropping number of Russian tanks with new ones. This is another reason why Cold War tanks are being brought out of storage, refurbished and deployed with only slight modifications made to their ancient technology. We're going to come back to this point in a little bit and examine some other reasons why the old T-55s and T-62s are being moved to Ukraine in large numbers. But before we do that, let's look at some statistics and specifications of these old Cold War models. The oldest tank that we've seen moving on the front lines is the T-55. As of yet, no World War III tanks can be confirmed to have been included in the ranks of Russian tank forces, but if the war continues and Ukraine destroys or captures Russian tanks at the same rate they have so far, it might not be too long before Russia needs to dig even deeper into their older stockpiles of vehicles. The T-55s were commissioned by the Red Army almost immediately after World War II ended, as Cold War tensions started to ramp up. These tanks are so old they are literally found in museums across the world. The T-55s were the first main battle tank ever used by the Soviet Union. Until the T-55 was developed, there were three distinctive types of tanks that had very specific roles on the battlefield. They were light, medium, and heavy tanks, each with their advantages and disadvantages. For example, the light tanks were quick and maneuverable and used to flank enemies, while the heavy tanks had more firepower but were bulky and slow. The main battle tank was designed to include the best features of all tank versions in one vehicle. The T-55 delivered on a lot of the elements that would make it an effective main battle tank and eventually became the most widely produced tank in the entire world. Between all the iterations and variants, over 100,000 T-55s were made. They were relatively cheap to construct, easy to use, and could be repaired quickly if needed. They were highly employed to suppress uprisings in Hungary in 1956 and Prague in 1968. However, when the T-55 went up against then-modern Western tanks in several Arab-Israeli conflicts and again in the Gulf War, it became very clear they were unable to compete. T-55s were being destroyed from up to 14 miles or 23 kilometers away. The most dominant tank in the region was now obsolete. So the Soviet Union pivoted and began phasing out the T-55 in the 1980s, even though there were still around 28,000 of them in active use. But instead of scrapping the T-55, Russia put them into storage, which is why they can be pulled out of warehouses and deployed to Ukraine today. However, this move is somewhat puzzling, as the reason the T-55s were first decommissioned around 40 years ago was that they couldn't compete with Western weapons and tanks. Unsurprisingly, the Western anti-tank measures that Ukraine has today are much more effective and therefore will easily be able to handle any T-55 they come across on the battlefield. The T-55s themselves were produced in Russia from 1946 to 1981, Poland from 1956 to 1979, and Czechoslovakia between 1957 and 1983. As we said, over 100,000 were built, but this number includes 35,000 T-54s, which was the first iteration of the tank, but with slightly fewer features. Another 27,500 T-55s were built in the Soviet Union, 13,000 Type 59, 69, and 79s, all of which were iterations of the original T-55, and constructed in China. 10,000 were constructed in Poland, and a final 11,000 54s and 55s made in Czechoslovakia. The T-55 weighs around 36 metric tons, is 9 meters or 29 feet 6 inches long, is 3.37 meters or 11 feet 1 inches wide, and can hold a crew of 4. The armor on the T-55 varies in thickness, with the front turret being 205 mm thick and the sides of the turret being 130 mm thick. The front of the hull is 120 mm thick, but the whole top is only 33 to 16 mm thick. This poses a significant problem if these tanks are hit with weapons such as javelins that drop from the sky instead of attacking straight on. The T-55 has a D-10T 100mm cannon, and the tank can hold 43 rounds. The secondary armament tends to be a 7.62mm SGMT coaxial machine gun. The engine's a V55 V12 water-cooled 38.88-liter diesel, which can generate between 500 to 800 horsepower depending on the model. This gives the T-55 an operation range of about 202 miles, or 325 kilometers, but the distance can be extended to around 380 miles or 610 kilometers if equipped with extra fuel tanks while traveling over favorable terrain. When the T-55 initially rolled off the assembly line, it was a force to be reckoned with. However, times have changed, and as these Cold War-era tanks are brought to the front lines of a modern conflict, they will be destroyed at an unprecedented rate, which will remind the Russians why they were retired in the first place. Then there's the T-62. These tanks were first deployed in 1961 and have been modernized throughout their lifetime. It's believed that Russia has around 5,000 of these slightly newer Cold War tanks in storage. However, the International Institute for Strategic Studies suggests that many of the 62s might be in just as bad shape as the T-55s and are a little better than scrap metal. Footage of Andrei Gurylev, a Russian statesman and staunch supporter of Vladimir Putin and everything he does, shows him touring a factory in Shita, Siberia that's upgrading an estimated 800 T-62s to be sent to Ukraine. It's here that the workers at the 103rd Armored Tank Repair Plant are laboring around the clock to try to make the 50-year-old tank somewhat ready for the modern weapons they'll be fighting against, although there is little hope that any modifications will make the tank able to stand up against the anti-tank weapons and modern tanks being sent to Ukraine for their offensive. The proposed upgrades to the T-62s will include new engines, communication systems, control systems, thermal imagers, and dynamic active protection. According to Andrei Gurylev, the T-62 was originally produced in the Soviet Union between 1961 and 1975, but in the late 80s, North Korea also started to construct versions of the tank. It's estimated that more than 22,700 were built during this time. The T-62 weighs 37 tons and is 9.34 meters or 30 feet 8 inches long and 3.3 meters or 10 feet 10 inches wide. Like the T-55, it's manned by a crew of 4, which includes a commander, gunner, loader, and driver. The armor on the 62 is thicker than its predecessor at 214 millimeters on the front turret and 153 on the side. However, the front of the hull is only 102 millimeters thick, while the hull roof is 31 millimeters thick, which poses the same problem as the 55 when it comes to modern anti-tank weapons that strike from above. On top of that, neither tank has reactive armor that's necessary to absorb some of the impact of an attack. The main armament on the T-62 is a 115mm U-5TS smoothbore gun, which the tank can hold 40 rounds for. It has a secondary armament of a 7.62mm PKT coaxial general-purpose machine gun with 2,500 rounds. The engine in this tank is the same V55 12-cylinder diesel as the T-55 with slight modifications, which gives it around 500 horsepower as well. The T-62 has an operational range of 280 miles or 450 kilometers on the road with two 200-liter fuel tanks aboard. Cross-country, the range is closer to 200 miles or 320 kilometers. The maximum speed of the T-62 is 31 miles per hour or 50 kilometers an hour on the road and 25 miles per hour or 40 kilometers an hour traveling on rougher terrain. Another Russian Cold War vehicle that's making an appearance in Ukraine is not exactly a tank, but is worth mentioning, as it already has been deployed to the front lines. British intelligence reported that Russia has deployed the BTR-50 to Ukraine. These armored personnel carriers were first used in 1954, making them only slightly newer than some of the T-55s on their way to the front lines. The transport vehicle weighs 14.5 tons, is 7 meters or 23.2 feet long, and 3.1 meters or 10.2 feet wide. Has a crew of 2 and can hold up to 20 passengers. The armor on the BTR-50s is a lot thinner than the tanks at 13 millimeters in the front and 10 millimeters on the sides and top. These transports can be equipped with 7.62mm SGMB medium machine guns carrying 1,250 rounds or a 14.5mm KPV heavy machine gun. Either way, its firepower and armor are limited. The BTR-50 has a 6-cylinder, 4-stroke inline water-cooled diesel with 240 horsepower and an operational range of about 250 miles or 400 kilometers. Its maximum speed is 27 miles per hour or 44 kilometers an hour on the road and 6.8 miles per hour or 11 kilometers an hour in the water. Yet, even with this Cold War transport's limited capabilities, more and more are making it to the front lines. This just shows that the Russian military is not just desperate for more tanks, but more armor in general. Unfortunately for Putin, Russia cannot manufacture vehicles or weapons fast enough to stand up against the coming Ukrainian offensive, which is one of the major reasons that Cold War tanks and armored vehicles are making a comeback. But there are several other key reasons why Cold War tanks are being deployed to the front lines. Yes, Russian forces desperately need them to hold their positions and replenish their dwindling numbers, but sanctions have also played a major role in Russia's decision to take the T-55 and T-62 out of retirement. At the beginning of the war, Western countries imposed harsh sanctions on Russia in the hopes that it would cripple the Russian economy and force Vladimir Putin to pull his forces out of Ukraine. This is not what happened, but many experts knew that the sanctions were unlikely to cause an immediate response. Instead, the sanctions implemented would have drastic consequences down the road. This is exactly what's happening in Russia right now. According to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, Russia's GDP dropped by 2.1% in 2022 due to sanctions. In the 1990s, Russia entered trade deals with many Western nations for technology, some of which was used in their tanks, vehicles, and weapons. Now the sanctions have been in place for over a year, and Russia cannot get the parts or tech it needs to effectively build more tanks. Older models like the T-55 and T-62 were built at a time when all their components were designed and constructed in the Soviet Union, or at least in the Soviet bloc. This makes them easier to repair and upgrade than more modern tanks that require difficult-to-acquire Western components. Intel, acquired by the Royal United Services Institute, suggests that Russia is dismantling everyday appliances, such as washing machines, to acquire microchips that can be repurposed for their weapons. Russia still gets 70% of its chips from China, but it's the stranglehold that the US and its close allies have on semiconductors that are hitting Russia the hardest in terms of replenishing their numbers or lost tanks. On top of that, the sanctions have limited Russia's access to optical systems, which they relied heavily on French imports for before the war. Now, with sanctions implemented, Russia is forced to use back channels and third parties to acquire the necessary equipment, which can be slow and expensive. All of these restrictions and sanctions have forced Russia to take their Cold War tanks out of retirement until they can figure out how to procure the technology they need to ramp up production. In the meantime, Russia is putting less sophisticated components, such as decades-old gunner sights, into modern tanks. This is enough to reduce the tank's effective range by up to 2 kilometers, or 1.25 miles. Another huge problem that sanctions are causing for Russian tank manufacturing is that it has limited the number of ball bearings coming into the country. Ball bearings are critical for any moving vehicle or moving parts on those vehicles. 55% of Russia's ball bearing supply used to come from Europe and North America. The number's been cut to 0 due to sanctions. A solution for Russia might be to make all the ball bearings themselves or import lower quality supplies from China, which will not help the effectiveness of their tanks. But until this happens, Russia will need to take more and more Cold War tanks out of storage to bolster its numbers. Another reason that T-55s and T-62s are coming out of storage is that these models are much less sophisticated than modern tanks. This is beneficial to Russia for a couple of reasons. Since the initial invasion, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency estimates Russia has suffered somewhere around 189,500 to 223,000 total casualties. This is a staggering number, and also the reason why Putin needed to conscript more than 300,000 men to replenish his ranks. However, a byproduct of this conscription is that Russia now has thousands and thousands of men who have limited military training and have never fought in an armed conflict in their life. Training these new conscripts on complicated modern tank technology and then sending them to the front lines would be a disaster. However, training conscripts on how to use Cold War-era technology is a lot less intensive and a more effective use of the newly enlisted men. This is especially true of the T-55s, which date all the way back to the 1950s and have fewer moving parts and basic targeting systems, even if the tanks themselves are more vulnerable than other models. Another factor being taken into consideration is that Russian forces are now taking up defensive positions instead of launching an offensive. It's much easier for conscripts to be set up in a tank to repel and attack than to carry out complex offensive maneuvers. The tactical ability of the T-55s and T-62s is much better suited for defensive operations, which might be another reason why they're being brought out of storage. Conscripts in these tanks will likely be responsible for providing supporting fire from long distances rather than pushing forward along the front lines. This doesn't mean that the Cold War tanks will be superior to what Ukraine will launch an offensive with, but they might not be completely useless. The most strategic use for the T-55 and T-62 tanks would be to dig them in at defensive positions and wait for Ukrainian forces to advance. The tanks would be hidden in deep pits with only their turrets sticking out and then could fire at any oncoming forces. This would provide a static defense for Russian forces, limit the amount of training needed by conscripts, and put the Cold War-era tanks to effective use. Will Russia do this? Who knows? The strategic planning on the Russian side of the war has been ineffective at best and a total disaster most of the time. So, we know that the reasons Cold War tanks are being deployed to the front lines are because Russia has lost so many tanks already, it can't rebuild its modern tank numbers fast enough due to sanctions, and older tanks are much easier for conscripts to use than newer vehicles. The question now becomes, what happens next? Ukraine will launch an offensive to make Russia pay for invading their borders. At least 18 Leopard 2 battle tanks have been successfully delivered to Ukraine, American Cougar armored trucks, American Stryker armored personnel carriers, and German Marder fighting vehicles have also been delivered. More Leopard 2s should be on their way, and the US is still planning to fulfill its promise to deliver M1 Abrams, the most sophisticated tank in the world. This is all very bad news for Russia, as the modern weapons and vehicles will decimate any Cold War-era tech that's on the battlefield. However, Ukraine is still being cautious and waiting for the right time and place to strike. Most military experts agree the success of the Ukrainian offensive will require patience, reliable intelligence gathering, and precision to penetrate Russian lines. There will be weak spots, especially where Cold War-era tanks are relied heavily upon. Ukraine just has to find these locations. It'll be through these narrow points in the Russian line that modern Western tanks will do the most damage. Their faster speed, thicker armor, and superior firepower will not only deal significant blows to modern Russian tanks, but they'll make any T-55s or T-62s in the area all but useless. Almost all military experts agree that Russia will sustain a huge amount of casualties if they try to use T-55s against modern tanks. But this just goes to show how desperate Putin is right now. It's important to not count Russia out quite yet, however. They still have a huge numerical advantage in terms of soldiers, equipment, and vehicles. A report on the war in February 2023 stated that the total number of aircraft alone in the Russian military is somewhere around 13 to 15 times more than Ukraine's. Russia's naval fleet is 12 to 16 times larger than Ukraine's, and Russia has approximately 7 to 8 times more tanks and 4 times more armored fighting vehicles. So if Ukraine is not careful and strategic with how they use its men and vehicles, its military could become overwhelmed by Russia's far superior numbers. Some military experts warn Russia might be trying to conduct a war of attrition, where their numbers will help them outlast the Ukrainian offensive even if they suffer more casualties. Putin's hope is that his forces can slowly whittle away the advantage Western weapons are giving Ukraine and just wait for their supplies and numbers to run out. However, there's no indication that Western nations will reduce their support or aid to Ukraine anytime soon. This is probably one of the biggest reasons why Russia is shipping Cold War tanks to the front lines. The Kremlin must now know that these tanks will not be able to defeat the Western weapons heading toward the front line for the offensive. But if Russia can continue to throw men and old tanks in the way of the Ukrainian military, they may eventually be able to exhaust their forces, even if it is at a great cost to Russia's own military and people. T-55 and T-62 tanks were never supposed to be used in the Russian military after their retirement, but now Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership are probably glad they didn't completely scrap them. These Cold War tanks might soon be the only thing standing in the way of Ukrainian forces claiming a decisive victory in the war. Now watch how Ukraine easily destroyed Russia's Terminator super tank, or check out Russia just lost the biggest tank battle of the war.